Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We are now about to begin a panel on creating ethical supply chains. You are free to enter questions in the Q&A box under the chat. Your moderator will take them, time permitting. I will now hand things over to Victoria Birch to start things off. Thanks so much. Hi, Victoria.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I've been having a few internet connection problems. My name is Victoria Birch, and I'm a technology and innovation partner at Military Schoolbuy in London. This panel on creating ethical supply chains. This is an area that has become increasingly important for many of our clients.
All right, in the meantime, we'll have GBBC CEO Sandra Rowe step in. Thank you, Sandra.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to just kick off because I think this is a very critically important topic. Global supply chains are set to take a real shift in everything, especially in the pandemic. Oh, Victoria.
Now, for the purpose of this panel, what we're proposing to do is to start off by taking a look at the problem, some of the risks and challenges that people are facing in this area. We're then going to take a look at how blockchain can mitigate some of those risks and challenges. And then we're going to move on to looking at innovation. So without any and a note to the order.
Hey guys, I hate to say this, but Victoria, your connection is really awful, so we're going to have to actually drop you, and I'm going to take over. Let me start with Melanie, who's kindly joined us. Melanie, it would be great if you could just talk a little bit about the standard setting that you've been doing with your organization. I've only recently learned about how wonderful your organization is from a number of partners that you work with. So it'd be great if you could just thank you again for joining us and give us a quick overview of the standard setting that you are doing in the supply chain space.
Yes, thanks, Sandra, and thank you for having me here. I was actually intrigued in the last panel to hear references to supply chain and different blockchain solutions that are working with end users, which is critical. GS1 is a global organization primarily focused on identification and data sharing standards for supply chains. We work in about 25 different industries. Our core bread and butter, of course, is retail, and we're most well known around the world for the UPC and EAN barcodes, which are used at the point of sale and scanned 6 billion times a day. So we've gotten involved in this space really because we've been driving supply chain efficiency for about 4 decades. And as blockchain emerged onto the scene about 3 years ago for our community, a lot of questions came up about whether this is complementary or would replace existing data sharing mechanisms. And so we stepped in as a member-driven organization to really try to help guide conversations and determine what opportunities there are for the intersection of standards and technology to help solve some of the common business problems people are trying to address leveraging blockchain.
Thank you so much for that. And I think, you know, following on with how critical standards are and setting, you know, pioneering work that's being done about reevaluating global supply chains, I would love it if Doug, as an entrepreneur, pioneer, could talk a bit about what Circulor is doing and the latest. I'm always very excited to hear what Circulor is up to.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. We started about 3 years or so ago now, been in production for a couple of years. We work with the likes of car manufacturers and more recently aerospace companies on the responsible supply chain challenges that they face using raw materials in their manufacture. To give you an example, cobalt, often associated with the use of child labor in the Congo, being used in the manufacture of electric vehicle batteries. Clearly, that is unacceptable to all of us. The challenge, of course, is the enormous complexity and asymmetry in that supply chain. And how do you reliably track a commodity that undergoes change all the way through its supply chain? So we're now looking at a whole variety of commodities, not just for car manufacturers. This morning I was discussing chocolate. So I'd far rather be eating it, but it's clearly there's issues in the supply chains too.
Right there with you. I'd rather be eating chocolate as well. Great. We're going to come back to a bit more about what Doug just mentioned. Actually, I want to go straight to Leanne about what Diginex is doing, because one of the things that I think has been really critical is around tracking labor. And people don't think of labor as part of the global supply chain, but actually it is. It's critical because of the workers. So Leanne, could you just give us a quick overview of what Diginex Solutions has been working on?
Hi, everyone. Diginex Solutions has been, I'd say, kind of piloting blockchain to look at how do we better track the labor supply chain. So that's to say, how do we bring not only greater transparency around, where that product moved, but also kind of looking deeper at what were the working conditions, and also how were the workers recruited who made that product. So we've been kind of exploring how do you use blockchain to create greater transparency and trust in those processes that are often not covered by social compliance audits. So we've been doing a lot of work with organizations like the International Organization for Migration around how do we bring greater security to the international migration process. So working with technology to have better document storage, to provide solutions to issues like contract substitution and deception in the recruitment process, so that workers are able to have a safe migration process, and to create a single set of truths for all those different actors in the supply chain.
Thanks so much for that. And certainly not least, Carrie. Everledger has been in this space for a number of years, and I've been following you guys since the beginning of your journey. You've accomplished so much. Could you give the audience an update on what Everledger's been doing around supply chain tracking and tracing?
Absolutely. It's wonderful to be in this panel. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Carrie George. I'm the Vice President and Head of Sustainability Solutions at Everledger. Everledger, for the last 5 years, has been operating in a number of different supply chains, starting in diamonds and then moving quickly into the gemstone market. We operate across luxury brands, including recently an announcement with the Queen, and continue to operate a number of other supply chains, including circular economy of batteries, as well as engaging on the provenance through circular economy and lifecycle management of a number of materials and supply chains. My work at Everledger has been focused mostly on how do we apply some of the engagement of the work I've done and a range of organizations from the US State Department to Apple and other jewelry companies into the blockchain world.
Fantastic. So I want to talk to you guys a bit about what some of the challenges are right now about how do we actually get all of this to scale. Because I had a conversation with a large asset manager yesterday, and they've basically put a new position in, which is someone in charge of sustainable investing. And one of the things that he mentioned to me that was missing is their ability to be able to invest in companies and organizations that are doing sustainable things, but in a quantifiable form. So, one of the challenges that he said to me is, look, I can probably figure out direct emissions, and I can probably work out, some of the more obvious top level, carbon footprint type metrics. However, he says he thinks DLT and blockchain could actually be critical in the place where he feels like indirect emissions are not being, as well documented because it's not transparent, and our global supply chains are not as transparent as they could be. So could I ask each of you to kind of comment on some of the challenges that you think that we have today, and what do we need to do in your respective corners to get over those hurdles and help meet good investment with, more transparent supply chains? Melanie, if you don't mind, if you could start us off, really appreciate it.
I love this question. I could talk about this for hours, but I'll tell you the primary, so I would say traceability is the use case that we've most commonly heard our members looking at relative to blockchain. So I'll just kind of ground it there. But I will say what came up about a year ago, because we've been asked by some of our biggest manufacturers and the retail partners to just make it work, right? They want to choose whatever traceability solution, whether it's ledger-based or not ledger-based, and they want them all to talk to each other, and it should just be simple. And the interesting thing that that I learned in speaking to an executive at a large pharma and med device manufacturer is it isn't really the technology that's the barrier for us. It's contractual relationships that prevent the sharing of data. So we want a transparent supply chain and we want to share data, but there are people in our company who are incentivized and in fact under legal right and business obligations not to share data. And so we've really been trying to look at novel uses of the technology like zero knowledge proofs, right, methods around obfuscation that allow you to share just what needs to be shared. But I'll tell you the culture of power and control and me being in control of my data is probably the biggest challenge that we have. No surprise, right? The human element is always an interesting challenge, but that is definitely something we're actively trying to showcase how technology can support culture and behavior needs, but also requires us to transform what we're doing as supply chain cultures.
Absolutely. I have a friend who constantly says to me, technology is great until people get involved. Not sure that I completely agree with that, but I get his point that he was making. So thanks, Melanie, for highlighting that particular challenge, which is absolutely true in pretty much every industry segment I can think of. So not just to supply chains. I think going back to Carrie, for a second, what are your thoughts around what some of the challenges you have seen? And also, you've been on a journey for quite a few years. So also give us a flavor of sort of what you've seen change over the number of years that you guys have been around. 5 years plus?
Yeah, 5 years plus. Absolutely. I think some of the things that as we are maturing in this engagement is we're recognizing that blockchain isn't the panacea. DLT is not the panacea. What it is not just efficiency, accuracy, but bringing more actors together in a way that will allow them to permission data and create that comfort so they move forward. Melanie's hitting on this, and I'm really excited for this panel also because I have been wanting to engage with Melanie. So wonderful opportunity to connect here. And we're both on the West Coast close enough, so we're feeling the pain. I think to your point, what we're seeing is when let me give a little context. My work at Apple was to launch the conflict minerals work. I had to go to literally hundreds of sites, sign not just personal NDAs sometimes or corporate NDAs, but personal NDAs in order to get data just for the release for supply chain information so I could get to the next actor and the next actor and the next actor. That permissioning process and smart contracts and relationships that are developing is not only critical for what we want to do for just transparency, but for the actual impact we want to have on the ground to start having smart contracts for mitigation and smart contracts for mitigation in the region it's happening. As we talk about the EU taxonomy and goals on climate change, this is going to be absolutely necessary. So we're not just picking off the easiest areas to mitigate climate change and by offsets, but actually in the region and locale that it's occurring. And that will go into everything from rehabilitation to human rights issues and tracking down the actual impacts, if not the individuals themselves, which also Leanne on the panel, wonderful to meet you today. But we've seen a maturation of thought around what blockchain and DLT will do for accuracy and transparency and countering fraud to these other applications in sustainability, human rights, and labor issues.
Carrie, thanks very much for that. And a further note, it is very early your morning in San Francisco, and Melanie in Colorado. I have to kudos, hats off to you for joining us this early. I don't know why we put the global supply chains session this early, but yes, well done. Doug, please give us your thoughts on some of the challenges of how we get this to scale. And you are beginning to see movement, I hope. You could give us some view from your point of view.
Yes, like Everledger. In fact, we're us and Everledger are working together on a couple of interesting things at the moment, but which touches on a theme that was made by Melanie just now around interoperability. It is inconceivable that whole industries will settle on a single solution, and ultimately we all want it to work like the internet, where everything talks to everything and we don't worry about what happens in the background. But of course, we are in the early days of the adoption of new technologies like blockchain combined with other technologies in supply chains, and it's the early pioneers who are taking some of that pain of trying to get people to communicate with one another. Transparency, is spoken about a great deal, but by definition, whether it is protecting one's IP or protecting one's commercial relationships, there's actually getting a sharing of information, even about the really high risk materials in supply chains like cobalt, is challenging. It's getting easier, and Melanie mentioned a number of sort of technology approaches, obfuscation, zero knowledge proofs, etc., which is starting to help. For us, the blockchain means you can't rewrite history, given that it takes months for material to travel from one end of a supply chain to another. But on its own, it isn't the solution. Therefore, we've all created slightly different versions of how you achieve transparency within a supply chain. And so this question of interoperability is one that will eventually create, hopefully, a sort of plug and play environment that Melanie touched on originally.
Right.
And this relates to standards. I think a month or so ago, one of the SEC commissioners was complaining about the lack of consistency in reporting ESG metrics. And at the moment, it's much like CSR reports were a few years ago, where everyone creates something glossy and it sounds good. But how do you scratch the surface and work out what's really going underneath it? There are some brands now starting to work actively to prove what they're doing. Yesterday, Polestar, which is an EV battery manufacturer, an EV car manufacturer, brand Challenger, spun out of Volvo Cars, published its complete methodology and calculation of its lifecycle assessments for its latest car, which is a first in the car industry, and a great step forward to trying to create a more open debate about something we're all interested in: the embedded carbon in the manufacture of otherwise polluting things like cars. So we're moving in the right direction, relatively slowly. Obviously, the technologies that we all work with are an enabler of that.
Right. And there are a number of work streams, as you mentioned, the data sharing, the behavioral changes, the technology, the standardization, the taxonomy that need to happen. But Leanne, I would love it if you could not only give us a sense of the challenge that you see happening, but also, and I will open this up to everyone, but I'm going to direct this to you as well, which is the kind of questions you get around, we talk about ethical supply chains, but oftentimes the countries that are the most vulnerable and need the most transparency are some of the poorest in the world, and putting the onus on them to somehow, be more transparent and not have the corruption, et cetera, it does seem unfair. How should we look at that as well? So if you could start with the challenges and just then talk about how we may address ethical standards for especially some of the poorest countries out there.
Sure. So most of my experience is in the apparel global supply chain, which I think, as everyone knows, was pretty hard hit by COVID. There was issues with stores closing down. There was issues in the global supply chain with orders being canceled when they had already been produced, workers getting laid off. There was just a whole host of issues. And then if you go back even in good times to the apparel supply chain, it's basically made up of millions of these small, medium, large size businesses that kind of track all the way from the raw material level. So let's say the cotton fields through to the textile manufacturers, to the processing of those raw materials, and then through to the cut and sew level. And then obviously all the way to the consumer. And it's a world that's really, really dominated by people having to operate under tight pressure. There's the pressure to innovate and use new technology, and basically to deliver basically on these very tight deadlines. And one of the things that I think has always struck me about that model is just this whole idea that there's very little incentives for people in global supply chains to really think as a collective, to think longer term about the impacts of their business decisions, and really to think about how they can operate in a way that is basically maximizing the profits for the greater number of people. So kind of the Jeremy Bentham model of how can we take this benefit and have it not just go to this very small group of people here, but really spread the benefits equally throughout different actors in the supply chain. So how do you make sure that the cotton farmer is benefiting, as much as that brand at the other end? But also, how do you make sure that the most vulnerable actors in the supply chain, so the workers in those communities, are also the ones that benefit from this whole model. So in a way, it's almost like a tragedy of the commons, in a sense, that there's really no one at the helm of these global supply chains. So we see that because they often cross multiple jurisdictions, they're not subject necessarily to this kind of overarching law. There is obviously laws and regulations in the countries where maybe the farm is or the cut and sew is, but we know that these global supply chains, especially in the lower tiers, operate in developing economies where there may not be the same laws and policies in place. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge that I see, is that there's really no incentives or enforcement for people to really think beyond their immediate profit, or what they can get out of the situation right then. Kind of going back to your question about how can we drive ethical standards? How can we have a consistent standard across all of these different economies? It's a really hard one. I definitely saw it when I worked in sustainability at a large global supply chain manager. And, I would get a lot of questions about, but why is our code of conduct so much more beyond what the national law is? And a lot of times business will say, well, it's only my responsibility to operate according to the law. But if there is no law on sexual harassment, if there is no law on child labor in that country, what does that mean? So it was really, I think it's really about how do we kind of equal out the playing field. And I think there's a lot of work going into this. I think the EU due diligence law, which is coming up in 2021, is one. There's, work that the UN is doing around having a binding treaty on business and human rights. There's obviously the UNGPs that came out. So we're moving in a direction, but we're still very far from where we need to be.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to put this back to the rest of the panel about how you're seeing developing countries, really sort of being able to, let's say there are even laws in place, right? But how do they even enforce it when they've got limited resources? And oftentimes the biggest challenges are in these developing countries to shine light. Don't get me wrong, US and other countries definitely have their own problems too, but how do we bring everyone along so that it's as fair as it can be, rather than placing the burden on just the developing countries to somehow, put these measures in place? If Doug, Carrie, Melanie, if you guys have views on this, would love just to get your thoughts. How do we help developing countries, or have you engaged with them yourself directly, and how do you see it working out?
Yes, I'm not sure if this is a good answer, but one of the things we've suggested is blockchain has also allowed us to re-engage in conversations around where the burden of this should come from. Like, I think government involvement is certainly one, like, and as Leanne, you are mentioning, like, regulatory events can be very compelling, and certainly in the US they have as well, right? Things that are happening with the FDA around drug supply chain security, things that are happening with the FDA around the new era of smarter food safety. Regulatory is a helpful push to get us moving in the direction of technology, but the two things that we've said are required for this to actually work, for truly traceable supply chains, where, and I love Leanne's point, where the benefit is to the greater and not just to the biggest, are really to us about automation and ubiquity. So how do we drive automation into the supply chain? Because putting the burden on small producers to provide extensive data about yield, about crops, of, protein sources and how they were raised and what they were fed, it's very difficult. They don't have the technology, they don't have the margin to do that. So I think things like IoT sensors are going to help drive some of that. I also think ubiquity is important for the downstream recipients. If they don't get everything automated, you only have half visibility. That really doesn't benefit me. So the other thing that leads me to is somebody's got to shake up the business models here. Like, there's got to be somebody subsidizing some of this. And we've actually seen this in the seafood space. Some of the large consumer-facing brands are actually kind of taking control of working with the people who are catching the seafood, the fishermen and fisherwomen, the smallest boats in the Pacific Rim, and how they're then able to provide traceability through the packing houses and processors. There's gaps right now at the retail level because technology adoption is a bit staggered, but then the consumer's also able to engage. And I think that was another thing, Leanne, that kind of came to mind for me, is connecting consumers to artisans and the far upstream producers through the use of QR code technology has been really kind of interesting. Being able to scan a package and know, right, that this basket was woven by this particular artisan, or this tuna was caught by this particular company, this boat in the South Pacific. So those are a couple of ways, but Sandra, I think you're kind of pushing at a bigger issue around governments, and I would say that's the heaviest lift because, as Leanne mentioned, the diversity in players at so many country levels.
Well, Melanie, I love you said the most uncomfortable thing that needed to be said, which is business models need to be shaken up, and frankly, some major paradigm shifts need to happen. So thank you for saying it. We're all thinking it. So, Carrie, Doug, Douglas, please. Actually, if Douglas isn't mind, we've got another question for you, Carrie, that I'm going to piggyback off of. So I'll let you go.
Okay.
But Douglas, if you could just please give us your 2 cents on the matter.
So firstly, echo the point that the poorest people in these supply chains at the upstream are not the ones that should be trying to, take the burden of this. Ultimately, it's us as consumers that is driving demand for things. And equally, we all, I think, as consumers, think that environmental damage and human rights abuses are unacceptable. But there's a cost associated with digitizing supply chains and auditing, et cetera, and that has to be borne somewhere. And the reality is that at the moment, certainly through the supply chains we work in, we find that the desire for transparency or the desire to manage the risk is not always matched by the willingness to pay to solve the problem. And increasingly, I think the end OEM or the end industrial consumer, before it gets to the us as the individual, is starting to write into contracts with their supply chain the requirements for things like transparency and the need to balance both price with sustainability measures. Particularly, I see this with carbon at the moment, where the carbon reporting through the supply chain is becoming an obligation, so that one can measure embedded carbon as we strive towards net zero targets in a number of industries. So, baby steps, and those baby steps in part are enabled by the sorts of solutions that some of us on this panel already start to operate in supply chains.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And then Carrie, if you don't mind giving us some of your views on, how we help developing countries who, do bear a lot of this burden just by the nature of where they sit in the supply chain. But also there's a question around how you see smart contracts being used to potentially help with the metrics, because I ultimately also believe we've got to bring the investment community who invests in these companies to add pressure. We need the consumer to add pressure, and the pressure needs to come from all different angles so that someone will indeed pay for this wholesale change that we need.
Absolutely. I just echo the entire panel here and their feedback. A few points. When we're talking about these regions around the world, we need to be emphasizing what infrastructure they already have and the organizations and stakeholder engagement they engage in to date. I'll emphasize a couple things. We do not need to duplicate effort. In a lot of the regions, there is mobile money that is highly successful. In a lot of the work I do when we're talking about artisanal miners may not all, maybe not the poorest of the poor of the artisanal miners, but probably well over 50% of many of our artisanal miners globally are using mobile money. We could be triangulating and reinforcing a default banking system that they are already using successfully and tying and becoming interoperable with that, as opposed to creating an entirely new infrastructure. That helps governments. When we start creating stability in a financial transaction, that will help government. One of the things I used to work with a lot of auditors in my early career, and one of the things we never got to is reporting back our findings in aggregated ways back to the countries. When we aren't doing that, we're not helping governments actually support and enforce their own legislation with CSR efforts. We are separating them. And if we are separating ethical compliance and human rights oversight, as well as pollution or other types of, standards that we have for audits, we're again just creating parallel tracks and oftentimes siphoning off focus. And that's something that we need to do better on. And with and this goes back to your smart contract dynamic in question, by finding ways with DLT to report not only data to the appropriate actors, but finding ways to reinforce local government engagement, national government enforcement. This will change the game. And to answer the question about smart contracts, I think we're going to see that as we start utilizing smart contracts for different types of compliance efforts, where X will equal Y. If you have completed an audit successfully, Y will happen. That could mean anything from a give back to a mitigation effort you might have on the ground, to working with different artisanal miners that we've had a partnership that we announced at WEF a couple years ago. We're tipping the farmer. Could there be an automatic response for different types of engagement and different types of positive engagement in the supply chain? These are all things that we can start utilizing well with smart contracts. I think on the investment side, this has to be done in a strategic and collaborative way. And I do think that groups that are operating with, looking at the EU taxonomy, looking about carbon compliance or carbon reporting in a more structured format, we'll see that we can utilize smart contracts for that, not only reporting, but then the associated action and proving out that it has occurred when different third parties, such as offset providers or others that are validating the data, can confirm through DLT that X has actually happened.
Thank you so much for that, Carrie. And you have all raised some critical points about the challenges. But as we are in our last bit of time together, I'd like to end with a hopeful note, because there are a lot of positive things happening. And frankly, the mood music around the world is that this is going to be a major focus point. Blockchain tracking and tracing will absolutely have a critical role to play, and frankly will help move us to a place where SDGs can be met and exceeded, because we all work together to achieve that. So there was a question here around a couple just solid examples, and I know a few of you have already mentioned carbon and cobalt and a few others, but can you just think about what are your most optimistic views on where we're going? And also, can you just maybe provide another example of a use case or something that you're looking at that is particularly promising? And I'm going to kick off with Leanne, if you have a couple areas that you see as just really growth mode and you're excited about.
Yeah, for sure. So I think just because everyone was talking so much about the role of government, and I completely agree with that. I used to work at the International Labour Organization, and one of the programs that I worked in called Better Work, they do a lot of work in bringing together the public labor inspectors with the Better Work assessors or auditors to share findings, but also to share their expertise on how to resolve issues in global supply chains. And it's been one of the very few examples that I've seen actually on how the public sector is really collaborating with the private sector on an area which really should be an area that we're all concerned about. But I do definitely feel like governments remain the primary body that should be responsible for safeguarding the rights of citizens in their countries. And we're starting on a new project called Alter with the International Organization for Migration, where we're going to be working with the government of the Philippines to actually build a blockchain-enabled platform where we're going to be doing assessments with recruitment agencies that are basically kind of supported through evidentiary documentation. So that's really kind of looking at their management systems, their commitments to ethical recruitment, no fee charging, et cetera. And that's actually going to link up with a government-led grievance and case management system. And there's actually NGOs involved in this as well. So it's a series of kind of all these different actors. And we're actually linking this up with the employers in the Middle East. So it's actually for Filipino migrant workers that are going from the Philippines to the Middle East. And it's going to be a bit of an end-to-end platform, really trying to build transparency and trust throughout this labor supply chain, but also really kind of connecting with workers and building on the really important point that Carrie had brought up about not like duplicating and making it very hard for the workers to log on to different sorts of technology. We're definitely going to explore how do you use some of the existing tools that workers use, like Facebook or Line or whatever it may be, to basically allow them to have a greater voice in that process. So I'm excited about that one just because of the government's involvement, but also this very heavy emphasis on remediation, which I think is often an ignored part in this whole discussion. It's almost actually quite easy to find issues in global supply chains, but it's a lot harder to try to remediate them and have outcomes that are satisfiable for the rights holder.
Thank you so much for that. Absolutely wonderful. Douglas, can I go to you to give us a, optimistic and, something that you find quite promising?
So two quick points. The first, I'm optimistic actually about the degree to which, companies that many would regard as competitors are starting to work together, whether it's through, projects like Hyperledger. 3 of us here are all using Hyperledger Fabric in order to drive scale adoption and interoperability questions. That's one thing to be optimistic for. The second is that, I see a significant potential for the circular economy, whether it is the reuse of scarce, critical resources, for example, the reuse of lithium-ion batteries, or the application of our solutions that we all have here to new challenges of scale. Plastic waste is one that we're working on at the moment around demonstrating traceability to underpin the chemical recycling of plastic waste. I think that's hugely exciting if we can demonstrate these things can work at scale in complex industrial supply chains.
Thanks so much. And absolutely excellent point about seeming competitors working together as well. We need to do this together. Carrie, could you offer up, your optimistic and positive thought for the audience?
Absolutely. I am just beyond thrilled to see the opportunities that we have in the emerging, in various emerging markets. Having gone to Tanzania twice last year and getting the request for ways in which to enter the legitimate market that I was getting on the ground in the gemstone market just was beyond inspiring. We were able to do a program where we were partnering with a nonprofit organization and helping train not only their workers on the ground, but also the miners, and the miners for the first time sitting directly with their brokers to do a transaction and directly put it in their mobile money account and document it on the blockchain. So they themselves were identified in a private format to their direct buyer, getting a percentage of increase that was at least fivefold than what they had got. So transparency does things when tied to the right type of engagement in the supply chain. Other things that I'm seeing a lot of hope in is just the opportunity for partnerships with different data sets that we haven't really thought of before. Academics with satellite imagery data, monitoring different regions of the world for biodiversity. How do we couple that with the different issues we're seeing so we start scaling compliance and scaling oversight in a smart way, targeting things in a different opportunity, and creating these partnerships to scale data and scale the smart, intelligent work that so many people are doing worldwide to the practical applications. So I feel as though one of the reasons I came to Everledger was to see a lot of these smart actors, these workers on the ground, this engagement that we're seeing globally really synthesized in a way for the direct product level claims that will start making movements happen faster and more directly.
Thank you for that, Carrie. And I have to say, you guys just gave me an idea. I love the fact that multi-stakeholders are getting together. And frankly, I think we do one in the future with the investment management community, AKA the asset managers, pension funds, et cetera, who invest significantly and care about sustainability with you guys. So thanks for that idea. And by the way, audience, love the chat going on the sidebar. Keep going. This is exactly what we want to be doing, is connecting. So if you don't already know these awesome panelists, then reach out. Melanie, round us out the last minute. Thank you.
Yep, thanks. I agree with everything that's been said. It's actually awfully hard to add anything of value to that other than really excited when technology gets us talking about being more collaborative versus less. And so I give blockchain lots of kudos for that. As much complication as it's added to my life in the last 3 years. Product recall is probably a big one that ties, in my mind, to sort of being transparent with consumers and supporting the safety and wellness of the people that are paying for the products we produce. And so looking at how blockchain has really helped us start to drive towards better recall, better tracking, both amongst partners and with government agencies, I think is something we're going to continue to explore. And, many props to Walmart for kind of spearheading that with some of the mango and pork stuff they did early on, but that's now spreading to other players. And so I echo a lot of the comments of my co-panelists around collaboration being critical, because a blockchain with one participant is really not going to solve our supply chain problem.
Well, thank you to every single builder, pioneer, leader here. It is a privilege. And anyone who wants to reach out, please reach out directly to our esteemed panelists. And thank you for your time. Over to you, Sophia.
Thank you all so much. We will now briefly break and move to the next session. Thank you to our panelists. We so appreciate patience and your flexibility as well.